The architecture of influence, how words shape minds. Introduction. There's an invisible force that quietly shapes nearly every important moment of your life. It is present when a stranger earns your trust within minutes, when a leader inspires thousands to act without issuing a single command, when a teacher changes the direction of students' future with one carefully chosen sentence, and when a simple conversation alters the course of a relationship forever. Most people never notice this force because it cannot be seen, measured, or touched, yet it surrounds us every day. It lives inside language. Words are often mistaken for simple tools used to exchange information, but information alone has never changed the world. Facts can educate, instructions can organize, and explanations can clarify. Yet the moments people remember years later are almost never built upon facts alone. They are built upon feelings. They are built upon vivid mental images that linger long after conversation ends. They are built upon emotions that quietly reshape beliefs without demanding permission. The greatest communicators throughout history understood this truth long before psychology attempted to explain it. They knew that the conscious mind may evaluate ideas, but the deeper mind experiences them. This book is not about manipulation, deception, or secret tricks hidden behind complicated psychological theories. Genuine influence has never depended upon controlling another person. Real influence emerges when your words reduce confusion instead of creating it, when they guide attention instead of demanding obedience, and when they allow another person to arrive at an idea that genuinely feels like their own discovery. That distinction changes everything. People resist pressure, but they willingly explore curiosity. They reject commands, yet they naturally follow compelling stories. They argue with statements, but they quietly answer questions inside their own minds. Every conversation is taking place on two levels at once. One level is obvious. It consists of vocabulary, grammar, logic, and the visible structure of speech. The other level is almost invisible. It consists of rhythm, expectation, implication, emotion, pacing, silence, certainty, uncertainty, and countless subtle signals that determine whether someone merely hears your words or begins to experience them. Most speakers spend their entire lives perfecting the first level, while remaining completely unaware of the second. The result is predictable. Their sentences are understood, but they are quickly forgotten. Their ideas are reasonable, yet they rarely inspire action. Their conversations remain efficient without ever becoming memorable. The purpose of this book is to introduce you to that hidden level of communication, not through complicated academic language, but through practical principles that can immediately transform the way you speak, write, negotiate, teach, persuade, lead, and connect with others. You'll begin to notice patterns that have always existed around you. You will recognize why certain speeches become unforgettable, while others disappear within hours. You will understand why some people naturally command attention even before they possess authority, while others struggle to keep the attention of close friends despite having brilliant ideas. More importantly, you will learn how these patterns can become part of your own communication without sounding artificial or rehearsed. As you continue reading, something interesting may begin to happen. You may find yourself paying closer attention to conversations in everyday life. Advertisements will sound different. Interviews will reveal hidden structures you never noticed before. Great storytellers will suddenly seem less mysterious because you will recognize the architecture beneath their words. You'll start hearing pauses that create anticipation, questions that quietly guide decisions, descriptions that awaken imagination, and rhythms that make ordinary language remarkably difficult to ignore. Once these patterns become visible, they are almost impossible to unsee. Do not expect instant mastery. Language is much like music. Reading about it creates understanding, but practicing it creates intuition. Every meaningful conversation becomes another opportunity to observe how attention moves, how emotion rises and falls, and how carefully chosen words can transform uncertainty into confidence or hesitation into action. Over time, these principles become less like techniques and more like habits, shaping not only how you communicate with others, but also how you speak to yourself. Internal dialogue follows many of the same patterns as external communication, and changing one often changes the other. Throughout the chapters ahead, We will explore the foundations of persuasive communication from a perspective that is both psychological and deeply practical. We will examine how attention is captured before logic begins, why stories consistently outperform arguments, how curiosity quietly dissolves resistance, how emotional imagery influences memory, how certainty is transmitted through structure rather than volume, and how authenticity remains the single most persuasive quality any communicator can possess. Each chapter builds upon the previous one, gradually revealing a complete framework for communicating with greater clarity, confidence, and lasting impact. By the time you reach the final page, you will not possess magical phrases capable of controlling minds, because such phrases do not exist. What you will possess is something far more valuable: a deeper understanding of how people naturally process language, how belief gradually forms, how trust quietly develops, and how ordinary conversations can become extraordinary opportunities to create genuine connection. The greatest communicators have never relied upon louder voices than everyone else. They relied upon greater awareness. They understood that every sentence guides attention somewhere, every question opens a mental pathway, every story creates an internal experience, and every conversation leaves something behind long after the words themselves have disappeared. So allow your attention to settle for a while, leave behind the constant noise of the outside world, and step into a different way of thinking about language. Because once you understand that words do far more than describe reality, that they actively shape perception itself, you will never listen, speak, or communicate in quite the same way again. Chapter 1. The Currency of Attention. Before anyone accepts an idea, they first give something far more valuable than agreement. They give attention. And attention has become the rarest currency in the modern world. Every notification, every headline, every conversation, every advertisement competes for the same limited resource, forcing the human mind to become increasingly selective about what deserves focus and what should be ignored. Most people assume that if their argument is logical enough or their information is important enough, others will naturally pay attention. Yet reality works in the opposite direction, because logic is evaluated only after attention has already been captured. If attention never arrives, even the greatest idea quietly disappears in the background noise of everyday life, leaving its speaker wondering why nobody seemed interested despite saying everything correctly. Think back to the last conversation you can remember in remarkable detail. Chances are you do not remember it because every sentence contained extraordinary information. You remember it because something about the experience captured your imagination. Perhaps someone described an ordinary event in an unexpected way. Perhaps they paused just long enough before revealing something important. Perhaps they asked a question that forced your mind to search for an answer before you even realized you were searching. Your memory did not preserve the conversation because of its facts alone. It preserved the emotional experience attached to those facts. This is one of the most overlooked principles of communication. People remember experiences far longer than explanations, and language becomes powerful when it creates experiences inside the listener rather than merely delivering information. Most conversations fail because they begin where they should end. They begin with conclusions. Someone immediately explains what they believe, what they want, or why they are right, expecting the listener to instantly care. But the human mind rarely accepts conclusions without first becoming curious about the path leading toward them. Curiosity acts like an open doorway through which new ideas can quietly enter. Without curiosity, every statement feels like pressure. With curiosity, the exact same statement becomes an invitation. This is why experienced communicators rarely rush toward the destination. They carefully construct the journey first, allowing anticipation to build naturally until conclusion feels inevitable rather than imposed. Imagine walking into a room where two different speakers are preparing to address the same audience. The first immediately announces that he has 5 important lessons everyone must hear. The second simply smiles for a moment before saying that years ago he witnessed something so unexpected that it completely changed the way he understood human communication, and that even today he still notices people making the exact same mistake without realizing it. Both speakers intend to teach the same lesson, yet only one has created a question inside the minds of the listeners. What happened? What mistake? Why did it matter? The audience is no longer passively listening. Their imagination has begun working before the explanation has even started. Once the mind begins searching voluntarily, attention becomes remarkably difficult to lose. Attention is rarely commanded. It is invited. This subtle difference separates memorable communicators from forgettable ones. Commands often create resistance because they remind people that someone else is attempting to control where their focus should go. Invitations feel entirely different because they preserve freedom. A carefully placed question, an unfinished story, an unexpected observation, or a vivid description gently encourages a listener to continue without feeling forced. The mind enjoys completing patterns. It naturally dislikes unfinished puzzles. Whenever language introduces an incomplete idea, attention instinctively remains engaged until completion becomes possible. Another overlooked aspect of attention is rhythm. Every meaningful conversation possesses an invisible rhythm much like music. Some speakers race through every sentence with identical speed and identical volume, creating a predictable pattern that quickly fades into the background. Others naturally vary their pacing. They slow down when approaching an important idea. They pause before revealing something meaningful. They shorten certain sentences before expanding others into rich descriptions that gradually immerse the listener in an unfolding mental picture. These variations constantly refresh attention because the brain is designed to notice change. Monotony encourages distraction. Variation renews awareness. Notice how children instinctively listen when someone begins with the words, "Let me tell you something that happened." Adults are no different. We often imagine that maturity transforms the way we process information. Yet beneath our professional language and logical thinking remains the same imagination that once eagerly waited to hear bedtime stories. Stories succeed because they temporarily replace analysis with experience. Instead of evaluating abstract ideas, the mind begins constructing internal scenes populated with people, movement, emotion, uncertainty, conflict, and resolution. During those moments, learning becomes almost effortless because information is attached to images rather than isolated concepts. This explains why examples frequently persuade more effectively than explanations. Consider the difference between telling someone that confidence influences communication and describing a nervous speaker whose voice gradually steadies after taking one slow breath before addressing the audience. The principle remains identical. Yet the second version gives the mind something concrete to experience. Images anchor memory. Abstract statements often drift away unnoticed because they lack a place to settle inside the imagination. Attention is also guided by contrast. Imagine entering a room that has remained completely silent for several minutes before hearing a single soft knock against the door. Even the quietest sound immediately attracts awareness because it interrupts expectation. Communication follows the same principle. Unexpected comparisons, surprising observations, carefully chosen metaphors, and gentle contradictions interrupt automatic thinking. Whenever expectations are challenged without creating confusion, curiosity naturally increases. The listener begins paying closer attention because the conversation no longer follows an entirely predictable path. One mistake many communicators make is believing that complexity creates authority. They fill their language with technical vocabulary, lengthy explanations, and unnecessary detail, assuming sophistication will increase credibility. In reality, unnecessary complexity often increases mental effort while reducing emotional engagement. Simplicity should never be confused with shallowness. The greatest teachers throughout history possess an extraordinary ability to explain profound ideas using language that almost anyone could understand. Clarity builds trust because clarity demonstrates genuine understanding. Confusion rarely impresses. More often, it simply exhausts. There is another layer beneath attention that few people consciously recognize. Every person continuously asks invisible questions during every conversation, even when those questions are never spoken aloud. Does this matter to me? Can I trust this person? Is this worth my time? Where is this leading? What does this mean for my life? Effective communicators answer these silent questions before objections have the opportunity to appear. They connect ideas to familiar experiences. They explain why something deserves attention before demanding agreement. They create relevance long before asking for commitment. Perhaps the most remarkable characteristic of attention is that it cannot exist in two places at once. Whenever someone vividly imagines a future possibility, they temporarily stop focusing on present distractions. Whenever they become emotionally invested in a story, outside concerns briefly lose their importance. This is why imagination possesses such extraordinary persuasive power. It redirects awareness without force. It gently replaces one mental experience with another. The listener never feels pushed because internally they are participating rather than merely observing. The strongest communicators understand that every sentence either strengthens attention or weakens it. Every unnecessary word slightly increases mental fatigue. Every meaningful image deepens engagement. Every carefully timed pause allows anticipation to grow. Every relevant story transforms abstract knowledge into lived experience. Over time, these seemingly insignificant choices accumulate until two people discussing the very same subject produce completely different results. One conversation is politely forgotten before the day ends. The other quietly influences decisions weeks, months, or even years later. As you move through the chapters ahead, begin observing attention everywhere around you. Watch how exceptional speakers begin conversations. Notice how successful negotiators ask questions before making arguments. Listen carefully to storytellers whose audiences remain completely absorbed even when nothing dramatic appears to be happening. Observe advertisements that instantly capture curiosity without revealing everything immediately. Most importantly, begin noticing your own conversations. You may discover that the moments people listen most carefully are not always the moments when you speak the most. More often, they are the moments when your words awaken something inside another person's imagination, because the deepest influence has never belonged to those who simply communicate information. It belongs to those who know how to guide attention. And once attention willingly follows, understanding often follows with it. Chapter 2. The Power of Mental Images. Every word you speak creates one of two things inside another person's mind. It either produces an image or it produces nothing at all. This simple distinction explains why some conversations disappear almost instantly, while others remain unforgettable for years. The human brain was never designed to think primarily in words. Long before language existed, it understood movement, faces, landscapes, danger, safety, distance, color, rhythm, and emotion. Words arrived later as symbols that point toward experiences already stored within the imagination. Because of this, language becomes powerful only when it succeeds in awakening those experiences instead of remaining trapped as abstract definitions. If your listener cannot see what you are describing, there is a good chance they will not truly feel it either. And if they cannot feel it, they are unlikely to remember it once the conversation ends. Consider the difference between telling someone that success requires consistency and inviting them to imagine a sculptor standing before a massive block of stone, removing only a few small pieces every day until months later a masterpiece slowly emerges from what once appeared to be an ordinary rock. The first statement communicates an idea. The second allows the listener to experience that idea. Their imagination quietly begins constructing a workshop. The sound of the chisel striking stone, the dust gathering on the floor, and the gradual transformation that cannot be appreciated after a single strike but becomes undeniable over time. Nothing magical has happened. The information remains the same, yet the experience surrounding the information has become dramatically richer, making the lesson far more likely to remain in memory. This is why metaphors have survived for thousands of years in nearly every culture. A metaphor does not merely compare two things. It borrows emotional meaning from one experience and transfers it onto another. When someone says that trust is like a bridge, your mind instantly understands much more than the literal sentence contains. You recognize that bridges take time to build, that they connect separate places, that they can carry tremendous weight once completed, and that a single structural failure may cause enormous damage. None of those ideas were spoken directly, yet they arrive naturally because your imagination completes the pattern without requiring lengthy explanation. Great communicators understand that the listener's own mind often performs the most persuasive work, provided it is given the right starting point. Notice how ordinary conversations frequently fail to create this internal activity. Someone explains their plans using numbers, schedules, objective, and facts while the listener politely nods, yet internally very little is happening. Compare that with someone who says, "I feel like I've been standing at the edge of a forest for years, knowing exactly where I want to go, but never taking more than a few steps inside." Immediately, the conversation becomes visual. The forest appears. The edge becomes visible. The hesitation acquires shape. Even if the listener has never experienced the exact same situation, they understand the emotion because the image provides a common language deeper than literal explanation. Images also possess another extraordinary quality. They compress enormous amounts of meaning into remarkably little language. Entire paragraphs of explanation can often be replaced by one vivid comparison. Imagine trying to explain resilience by listing psychological definitions, behavioral characteristics, and scientific observations. Then imagine simply describing a tree that bends dramatically during a storm while rigid branches around it snap beneath the same wind. Within seconds, a lesson becomes emotionally intuitive. Flexibility is no longer an abstract concept. It has become something the listener can almost see moving before their eyes. The most memorable speakers rarely overwhelm audiences with constant imagery. However, they understand that powerful images require space to breathe. After introducing a meaningful picture, they naturally slow their pace, allowing the listener's imagination to complete details independently. This is one reason pauses are so effective. During silence, the brain continues working. It fills missing pieces, strengthens emotional associations, and transforms spoken language into personal experience. Many inexperienced communicators become uncomfortable with silence because they assume every second must contain words. In reality, some of the deepest persuasion happens precisely when nothing is being said at all. Another fascinating characteristic of mental imagery is that people often remember their own internally generated details more vividly than the original description. Suppose you describe an old wooden cabin surrounded by towering pine trees during early winter. You never mention the smell of burning wood, yet many listeners will naturally imagine it. You never describe the temperature, yet they may feel the cold air against their face. You never mention the sound of distant birds or the crunch of snow beneath footsteps, yet those sensations quietly appear. The imagination eagerly completes unfinished scenes. This is why skilled communicators deliberately avoid over-explaining every detail. They trust the listener to become an active participant in building the experience. Questions can dramatically strengthen this process because they force the imagination into motion. Rather than saying that confidence changes posture, you might ask, have you ever noticed how differently a person walks after receiving life-changing news? The mind immediately searches through memory, comparing experiences until an answer begins to emerge. During that search, attention becomes deeply focused because the listener is no longer receiving information passively. They are generating it themselves. Self-generated conclusions usually feel more convincing than externally delivered arguments because they arise from personal experience instead of external instruction. This principle extends far beyond public speaking. In everyday conversation, relationships, negotiations, leadership, education, and business, people respond not merely to facts, but to the pictures those facts create. A manager explaining the future of a company may discuss quarterly projections and strategic objectives, or they may describe a ship gradually changing direction before entering calmer waters. A parent teaching patience may describe planting seeds that remain invisible beneath the soil long before the first green leaves appear. A coach may explain discipline using schedules and routines, or by describing a blacksmith repeatedly heating and shaping steel until strength emerges from countless seemingly repetitive strikes. Each approach communicates information, Yet only one consistently awakens imagination. There is also a hidden emotional dimension to imagery that deserves careful attention. Images rarely arrive alone. They bring feelings with them. Picture yourself standing at the top of a mountain overlooking an endless valley illuminated by the first light of sunrise. Even without explicit emotional language, many people experience a sense of possibility, freedom, or peace. Now imagine a narrow hallway with flickering lights and closed doors stretching into darkness. Again, emotion appears almost automatically. The images themselves carry psychological weight. Because of this, wise communicators choose descriptions that naturally support the emotional direction they hope to create instead of attempting to force emotion through exaggerated language. Perhaps the greatest mistake people make when attempting to become persuasive is assuming that stronger influence requires stronger words. They search for more dramatic adjectives, louder expressions, or increasingly forceful statements. Yet genuine influence often grows through greater precision rather than greater intensity. A carefully chosen image whispered calmly may leave a far deeper impression than a passionate speech overflowing with emotional vocabulary. The imagination responds to clarity. It responds to specificity. It responds to experiences it can reconstruct internally. When those experiences become vivid enough, persuasion begins occurring naturally because belief follows perception more readily than argument. As you continue noticing conversations throughout your day, pay close attention to the language that remains with you long after the speaker has disappeared. You will probably discover that you remember remarkably few exact sentences, yet you vividly remember scenes, stories, comparisons, and moments that cause you to picture something internally. That observation reveals one of the deepest truths about communication. People rarely carry away our words exactly as we spoke them. They carry away the mental world those words created inside their own minds. Learn to shape that world with honesty, clarity, and purpose, and your communication will possess a depth that extends far beyond information alone, because the imagination has always been a quiet bridge between language and lasting influence. Chapter 3. Questions that guide the mind. Few people realize that the most influential communicators are not necessarily those who give the best answers. More often, they are the ones who ask the most effective questions. A statement travels in only one direction. It moves from the speaker toward the listener and waits to be accepted or rejected. A question behaves very differently. The moment a genuine question is heard, the listener's own mind immediately begins searching for an answer, often before any conscious decision has been made to participate. This automatic search is one of the most fascinating characteristics of human psychology because it transforms passive listening into active thinking. Instead of pushing an idea into someone's mind, a well-constructed question encourages them to walk toward the idea themselves. And people naturally trust conclusions they believe they have discovered far more than conclusions that were simply delivered to them. Think about how often your own attention changes the moment someone asks a meaningful question. If a stranger walks up and says, "Confidence is built through repetition," you may agree or disagree without much emotional involvement. But if that same person asks, "Can you remember a moment when you suddenly realized you were capable of something you had once believed impossible?" Everything changes. Instantly, your attention turns inward. Memories begin moving beneath the surface. Faces, places, emotions, and forgotten experiences quietly emerge without effort. The speaker has not given you information. Instead, they have activated your own imagination, allowing your experiences to become part of the conversation. This internal participation is what makes questions remarkably persuasive without appearing forceful. One reason questions possess such influence is that the human mind dislikes uncertainty. Whenever an unanswered question appears, attention naturally remains attached until some form of resolution becomes available. This tendency has shaped storytelling for thousands of years. Every compelling novel begins by introducing uncertainty. Every memorable film raises questions before providing answers. Every successful mystery keeps the audience mentally engaged because curiosity refuses to disappear until the missing pieces finally connect. Conversations operate according to the same principle. A carefully timed question quietly creates an open loop inside the listener's thinking, encouraging continued attention without requiring constant effort from the speaker. Not all questions produce the same effect, however. Some invite reflection while others create resistance. Consider the difference between asking, "Why haven't you succeeded yet?" and asking, "What small change would create the biggest difference if you began today?" The first question immediately encourages defensiveness because it focuses attention on failure. The second naturally directs awareness toward possibility. Both ask about improvement, yet the emotional experience surrounding each question differs dramatically. Great communicators understand that the direction of attention matters just as much as the content of the conversation itself. Where attention goes, emotion usually follows. Another powerful characteristic of thoughtful questions is their ability to bypass unnecessary argument. Imagine trying to convince someone that they underestimate their own abilities. You could spend 20 minutes listing evidence, offering encouragement, and explaining psychological research. Or you might simply ask, if someone with your exact skills walked into this room today, what advice would you give them? Surprisingly often, people offer themselves far wiser guidance when temporarily viewing their situation from another perspective. The speaker has not argued. They have simply rearranged perception, allowing the listener to observe familiar circumstances through a different mental lens. Questions also influence pacing. Most conversations move too quickly because both people focus almost entirely on exchanging information. Yet meaningful influence often requires slowing thought rather than accelerating it. When someone hears a question that cannot be answered immediately, silence naturally appears. Many inexperienced communicators become uncomfortable during these moments and rush to fill the space with additional explanations. Skilled communicators do the opposite. They allow silence to perform its quiet work. During those few seconds, the listener organizes memories, weighs possibilities, and gradually constructs an answer. The conversation becomes deeper precisely because less is being said. There is another subtle principle hidden within effective questioning. The most influential questions rarely demand facts alone. They invite imagination. Compare these two examples. Do you want to become more confident? Produces a short answer that usually ends a conversation. Now consider, imagine waking up 1 year from today with complete confidence in every important conversation you have. What would be the very first thing that people around you would notice had changed? Suddenly, the mind begins creating scenes rather than statistics. It pictures future interactions, altered posture, different facial expressions, calmer emotions, stronger decisions, and perhaps entirely new opportunities. The question has quietly shifted awareness from abstract desire toward concrete experience. This explains why coaches, therapists, exceptional teachers, and experienced leaders often rely more heavily upon questions and instructions. Their objective is not merely to provide solutions, but to strengthen independent thinking. Advice can solve today's problem. Better questions often improve tomorrow's thinking. When people learn to ask themselves more useful internal questions, their decisions gradually become more effective without requiring constant external guidance. In this sense, questions are not only communication tools. They become thinking tools capable of reshaping the quality of one's entire internal dialogue. The conversations we hold with ourselves deserve particular attention because they influence nearly every external interaction we experience. Many people unknowingly ask themselves questions that reinforce anxiety, frustration, or limitation. They wonder why everything seems difficult, why opportunities never appear, why other people succeed more easily, or why they always feel uncertain. The mind faithfully begins searching for evidence supporting whatever question has been asked. Change the question, and the search changes as well. Instead of asking why success feels distant, ask what skill deserves the greatest attention today. Instead of wondering whether failure is possible, ask what preparation will make success more likely. The circumstances may remain unchanged, yet perception gradually begins moving toward possibility instead of paralysis. One remarkable quality of thoughtful questions is that they communicate respect. They acknowledge that the other person possesses experiences knowledge, emotions, and perspectives worth exploring, rather than treating conversation as a performance designed to display intelligence. Questions transform it into a shared process of discovery. This shift fundamentally changes the emotional atmosphere. People feel heard before they feel persuaded. They become more willing to explore unfamiliar ideas because they no longer feel that agreement is being demanded. Curiosity replaces confrontation, and collaboration quietly replaces competition. Stories often become even more compelling when they contain unanswered questions woven naturally throughout their structure. Imagine beginning with the sentence, "The most confident person I have ever met taught me something unexpected during conversation that lasted less than 5 minutes." Instantly, several questions appear. Who was this person? What happened? What was the lesson? Why only 5 minutes? Notice that no direct request for attention has been made. Curiosity performs the work automatically because unfinished patterns naturally encourage completion. The purpose of asking meaningful questions is never to manipulate another person's thinking. Rather, it is to create the conditions under which genuine insight becomes more likely to emerge. Insight cannot usually be forced. It arrives quietly when attention, curiosity, emotion, and reflection intersect at precisely the right moment. Questions help create that intersection. They slow hurried thinking, awaken imagination, uncover assumptions, and gently illuminate possibilities that previously remained unnoticed. Often the greatest transformation during a conversation does not occur because someone hears a brilliant explanation. It occurs because they hear a single question that continues echoing in their mind long after conversation has ended. As you continue through this book, begin paying close attention to questions surrounding your everyday life. Notice which conversations energize curiosity and which immediately shut it down. Observe how exceptional communicators invite reflection instead of demanding conclusions. Most importantly, begin listening to the questions you quietly ask yourself each day, because those invisible conversations shape your beliefs more consistently than almost any external influence. Change the quality of your questions, and over time you may discover that the quality of your thinking, your communication, your relationships, and even your future gradually begins changing alongside them, not through force or pressure, but through the remarkable ability of a single well-placed question to guide the mind toward possibilities it had not yet considered. Chapter 4. The Rhythm of Speech and the Psychology of Trust. Long before another person decides whether your ideas deserve to be believed, their mind begins answering a quieter and far more important question. Can this person be trusted? Most people assume that trust is earned almost entirely through reputation, credentials, experience, or evidence. And while those elements certainly matter, they represent only part of the picture. Trust is also communicated through rhythm, consistency, emotional stability, and the subtle harmony between what someone says and how they say it. Two people may deliver the exact same message using identical words, yet one immediately feels authentic, while the other somehow feels rehearsed or uncertain. The difference often lies not inside the vocabulary itself, but within the invisible structure surrounding it. Because language is never experienced as isolated words. It is experienced as movement, pacing, timing, certainty, and emotion flowing together into a single impression. Every conversation possesses its own natural tempo. Some unfold like a calm river, allowing each idea enough space to settle before the next appears. Others resemble rushing water, carrying so many thoughts so quickly that nothing has sufficient time to leave a lasting impression. Many inexperienced speakers believe that speaking faster demonstrates intelligence or confidence, yet the opposite frequently occurs. When language moves faster than the listener's imagination can comfortably follow, attention gradually weakens. The mind becomes occupied simply trying to keep up instead of absorbing meaning. Communication stops feeling like discovery and begins feeling like work. And whenever listening becomes exhausting, influence quietly begins disappearing. One of the simplest ways to strengthen communication is to understand that silence is not the absence of language. Silence is part of language itself. A pause placed at the right moment often carries more emotional weight than another sentence ever could. Imagine someone sharing an important personal story without stopping for a single breath. The words may be clear, yet the emotional impact slowly fades because the listener never receives time to experience what has just been heard. Now imagine the same story interrupted by brief moments of stillness immediately after meaningful observations. During those silent seconds, the imagination quietly fills with emotion, reflection, and expectation. The listener becomes an active participant instead of a passive observer. The conversation begins breathing rather than merely continuing. Great storytellers instinctively understand this principle. They do not rush toward the ending because they recognize that anticipation is one of the strongest forces in human attention. Every carefully timed pause gently increases emotional investment. Every moment of patience signals confidence. Ironically, people who feel uncertain often attempt to eliminate silence by speaking continuously, believing that constant explanation will prevent misunderstanding. Yet excessive explanation frequently creates the very uncertainty it hopes to avoid. Confidence rarely sounds hurried. It sounds composed. It trusts that an important idea does not need to be chased because it possesses enough value for people to follow naturally. Rhythm is created not only through pauses, but also through variation. Imagine listening to music in which every note possesses identical volume, identical length, and identical timing. Even the most beautiful melody would eventually lose its emotional power because the brain quickly adapts to predictable patterns. Speech follows the same psychological rule. A conversation becomes engaging when moments of intensity alternate with moments of reflection, when shorter sentences occasionally interrupt longer ones, and when calm observations naturally prepare the listener for more emotionally significant ideas. Variety keeps attention alive because the mind continuously notices change. Another overlooked source of trust is congruence. Congruence simply means that every aspect of communication points in the same direction. Imagine hearing someone say they are completely relaxed while their breathing becomes shallow, their shoulders remain tense, and their speech accelerates with every sentence. Even if the listener cannot identify the contradiction consciously, something feels inconsistent. Human beings are remarkably skilled at detecting these subtle mismatches, because throughout history, survival often depended upon recognizing whether another person's external behavior matched their internal intentions. Authentic communication, therefore, requires more than carefully selected language. It requires emotional alignment between thought, voice, posture, facial expression, and timing. When those elements support one another naturally, trust begins developing almost effortlessly. Interestingly, certainty does not require absolute confidence in every situation. In fact, people often trust speakers who comfortably acknowledge uncertainty where appropriate. Consider the difference between someone claiming to possess every answer and someone calmly explaining that while no one can predict every outcome, certain principles consistently produce better results over time. The second approach frequently feels more believable because it reflects intellectual honesty. Authentic certainty does not mean pretending to know everything. It means speaking clearly about what you genuinely understand while remaining comfortable admitting what you do not. This balance creates credibility because honesty itself becomes part of the message. The emotional state carried into a conversation also shapes its rhythm in ways many people never notice. Anxiety speeds thought. Frustration shortens patience. Fear encourages excessive explanation. Genuine confidence, however, allows attention to remain fully present with the other person instead of constantly monitoring one's own performance. This is why exceptional communicators often appear remarkably calm even in challenging situations. Their primary focus rests not upon sounding impressive, but upon creating understanding. When attention shifts away from self-consciousness toward genuine curiosity about the listener, communication naturally becomes more relaxed, more responsive, and more persuasive. There is another fascinating phenomenon that quietly strengthens trust between people. Human beings naturally begin synchronizing with one another during meaningful conversations. Speech patterns subtly align. Body language gradually becomes more similar. Smiles appear with similar timing. Even breathing may unconsciously adopt a shared rhythm. This process cannot be forced convincingly because artificial imitation usually feels unnatural. It emerges most effectively when one person genuinely pays close attention to the emotional pace of the conversation, instead of mechanically following a prepared script. Listening, therefore, becomes just as influential as speaking. Those who truly listen often create deeper trust than those who merely communicate well. One reason storytelling remains such an effective communication tool is that stories naturally possess rhythm. Every compelling narrative alternates between uncertainty and resolution, movement and stillness, challenge and progress, tension and relief. These emotional shifts mirror the rhythms through which human beings naturally experience life itself. A story that contains no difficulty feels empty because nothing meaningful has been overcome. A story containing only difficulty becomes exhausting because hope never appears. Balance creates emotional movement, and emotional movement sustains attention. Many people mistakenly believe that influence comes from having the perfect sentence prepared for every situation. In reality, influence is far more adaptive than that. It depends upon noticing the emotional state of the conversation as it unfolds and adjusting rhythm accordingly. Sometimes another person needs encouragement rather than instruction. Sometimes they need silence instead of advice. Sometimes they need a thoughtful question rather than another explanation. Communication becomes powerful when language serves a moment instead of forcing the moment to fit previously prepared language. Perhaps the deepest form of trust emerges when listeners feel that nothing important is being hidden from them. This does not require revealing every private detail of one's life. Rather, it requires consistency between intention and expression. When people sense that a speaker genuinely hopes to clarify rather than impress, to contribute rather than dominate, and to understand rather than simply persuade, defenses gradually soften. The conversation stops feeling like a contest and begins feeling like cooperation. At that point, influence becomes almost invisible because it no longer resembles influence at all. It resembles understanding. As you move toward the final chapter of this book, begin paying attention not only to the words people choose, but also to the rhythm surrounding those words. Notice who speaks calmly when others become rushed. Observe how trusted leaders naturally create space for important ideas instead of overwhelming listeners with endless information. Listen for pauses that increase anticipation, variations that maintain attention, and moments when authenticity quietly outweighs eloquence. You may gradually discover that people rarely remember every sentence spoken during an important conversation. What they remember is how that conversation made them feel. They remember whether they felt understood, respected, inspired, reassured, challenged, or encouraged. Those emotional memories become the true foundation of trust. And once trust exists, language gains a depth and influence that words alone could never achieve. Chapter 5. Becoming the voice people remember. Every meaningful conversation leaves something behind. Sometimes it leaves information that disappears before the day has ended. Sometimes it leaves emotion that quietly influences decisions long after individual words have been forgotten. The difference rarely depends upon intelligence, vocabulary, or natural charisma. It depends upon whether communication reaches only the surface of another person's attention or whether it continues echoing after the conversation is over. The most memorable communicators understand that influence is never measured by applause, compliments, or immediate agreement. It is measured by what people continue thinking about when the room becomes quiet again. If your words remain present after your voice has disappeared, then genuine influence has already begun. Throughout this book, we have explored attention, imagination, questions, rhythm, and trust, not as isolated techniques, but as interconnected elements of a single process. Attention opens the door. Mental imagery gives ideas emotional shape. Questions encourage personal discovery. Rhythm keeps the mind engaged without creating fatigue. Trust allows every other principle to function naturally. Remove any one of these foundations and communication becomes weaker. Strengthen them together, and conversations begin developing a depth that cannot be explained by words alone. What appears from the outside to be charisma is often nothing more than these quiet principles working together with consistency. One of the greatest misconceptions about influential communication is the belief that extraordinary speakers are born rather than developed. Certainly, some individuals begin life with natural confidence, expressive voices, or engaging personalities. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that communication is far more dependent upon awareness than talent. Every exceptional communicator once struggled to express ideas clearly. Every respected leader once experienced uncertainty. Every memorable storyteller once told stories that failed to hold attention. Improvement came not from waiting for confidence to arrive, but from repeatedly observing how language affected people and gradually refining each conversation through experience. This process resembles learning to play a musical instrument. At first, every movement feels deliberate. Each note requires conscious attention. Progress seems frustratingly slow because the mind constantly analyzes what should happen next. Then something remarkable occurs. Repetition gradually transforms conscious effort into instinct. The musician stops thinking about individual notes and begins expressing emotion through music. Communication develops in exactly the same way. Initially, you may consciously remember to ask better questions, create stronger images, slow your pacing, or allow silence to remain for another second. Eventually, those habits become part of your natural style. Instead of remembering techniques, you simply become a more attentive communicator. Authenticity deserves special attention because it is impossible to replace with technique. Many people attempt to imitate speakers they admire, borrowing vocabulary, expressions, gestures, or speaking styles in hope of reproducing similar influence. While studying others can certainly accelerate learning, imitation has clear limitations. Listeners possess an extraordinary ability to recognize when communication feels borrowed rather than genuine. Authenticity emerges when principles become integrated into your own personality instead of covering it. Two people may understand identical communication strategies while expressing them in completely different ways, and both can become equally compelling, because influence grows strongest when honesty and skill exist together. Another lesson worth remembering is that influence should never become the primary objective of communication. The paradox is surprisingly simple. People who become obsessed with influencing others often create unnecessary pressure that weakens their communication. They begin monitoring every sentence, searching for perfect wording, analyzing every reaction, and worrying whether they appear persuasive enough. Their attention shifts away from understanding the listener and toward evaluating themselves. Genuine influence usually appears as a consequence of meaningful connection rather than a substitute for it. When your primary objective becomes helping another person understand, encouraging thoughtful reflection, or creating genuine clarity, persuasion often follows naturally because trust has already been established. You will also discover that not every conversation requires influence. Wisdom includes recognizing when another person simply wishes to be heard rather than guided. Sometimes the greatest communication skill is remaining silent while someone organizes their own thoughts aloud. Sometimes encouragement accomplishes more than advice. Sometimes empathy creates greater transformation than explanation. Language possesses tremendous power, but so does restraint. Knowing when not to speak often reflects greater mastery than knowing exactly what to say. As your awareness develops, you may begin noticing communication patterns almost everywhere. Political speeches, interviews, documentaries, films, advertisements, podcasts, classroom lectures, business presentations, and even ordinary conversations between friends gradually reveal structures that once remained invisible. You will hear unfinished stories designed to sustain attention. You will recognize questions intended to direct thought. You will notice emotional contrasts, carefully placed pauses, vivid metaphors, and recurring patterns that quietly shape perception. This awareness should not encourage cynicism. Instead, it should deepen appreciation for language itself. Communication becomes fascinating once you realize that nearly every memorable message follows principles hidden beneath its surface. Perhaps the most important conversation you will ever influence, however, is the one taking place inside your own mind. Every day you describe yourself, your future, your abilities, your limitations, your opportunities, and your challenges using language that gradually shapes perception. If your internal dialogue constantly reinforces fear, uncertainty, and inadequacy, those descriptions eventually begin feeling like objective reality. Yet the opposite is equally true. When your internal language becomes more balanced, more constructive, more curious, and more compassionate without abandoning honesty, your behavior gradually begins reflecting those changes. External communication almost always mirrors internal communication, because the words we repeatedly tell ourselves eventually become the foundation from which we speak to everyone else. The principles contained within these pages are not formulas guaranteeing agreement in every conversation. Human beings remain wonderfully unpredictable, carrying unique histories, emotions, values, and experiences that no communication technique can completely overcome. Some people will misunderstand you despite your greatest efforts. Others will disagree while respecting your perspective. Influence has never meant controlling outcomes. It means consistently increasing the likelihood that your ideas will be understood with clarity, received with openness, and remembered with meaning. Beyond that point, every individual remains free to decide their own path, and that freedom is precisely what gives authentic communication its integrity. As you close this book and return to the countless conversations waiting beyond these pages, resist the temptation to change everything at once. Instead, choose one principle and observe it carefully throughout the coming days. Perhaps focus on asking more thoughtful questions. Perhaps practice allowing brief moments of silence after important ideas. Perhaps pay greater attention to creating vivid mental imagery instead of offering abstract explanations. Small improvements repeated consistently create transformations that dramatic efforts rarely achieve. Just as rivers carve mountains not through force, but through persistence, meaningful communication develops through thousands of ordinary conversations gradually shaped by greater awareness. Years from now, you probably will not remember every concept discussed in these chapters, and that is perfectly natural. What truly matters is something far simpler. If you begin listening more carefully than before, speaking with greater clarity, creating richer mental experiences through language, asking questions that awaken reflection instead of resistance, and approaching every conversation with genuine respect for the person in front of you, then these pages will have served their purpose. Because remarkable communicators are not remembered simply for the beauty of their words. They are remembered because people consistently felt wiser, calmer, more capable, and more understood after speaking with them. That is the highest form of influence, the kind that requires no manipulation, no performance, and no illusion. It is built one conversation at a time, one carefully chosen sentence after another, until eventually your voice becomes associated not merely with information, but with clarity, confidence, and lasting connection. When that happens, you will discover something that many spend a lifetime searching for. The greatest power of language has never been the ability to control minds. It has always been the ability to illuminate them.